shortly. But with that said, welcome everybody. Over to you, Preston.
Alrighty, thanks so much, Giannis. This is probably, I think, maybe my fourth or fifth time speaking on the members call. So it's so wonderful to see so many people that I already know, especially those that I've connected with in the last week or two, as well as a lot of folks that I'm looking forward to meeting throughout this call and also in future times we have together. So Universal CMS, right? This is something that has come up quite a bit over the past few months that I've been working on this concept. And, I want to kind of preface this by, sharing a few thoughts and a few anecdotes. One of the things that I've noticed and tracked over the last few years is the notion of the content management system market and industry being to some degree fragmented and to some degree polarized. And I think Sana Remeke said it quite eloquently as well when she called the market currently quite polarized. One of the things that I think is very clear is that we see among the different personas that we work with a bit of consternation when it comes to the experiences that the CMS market currently provides. If you look at the hybrid headless or monolithic or less charitably, the legacy segment of the CMS market, a lot of developers are very unhappy, and that makes sense given the antiquated developer experiences that were characteristic of the late 2000s and early 2010s. By the same token, however, we do know, and there is a lot of evidence that shows that there are a lot of editorial and marketing organizations that are really concerned about the ways in which headless and composable CMSs are evolving and making it harder for them to do their jobs. The CMS is ultimately a very unique software vertical. The reason why I say that is because it occupies a very unique ecological niche in the software market, right? If you think about a lot of the other systems that we work with on a daily basis, CRM systems, CDPs, DAMs, a lot of these software or SaaS tools really primarily only have a single overarching persona that they have to treat as a first-class citizen. The CMS, however, stands alone in that the CMS is uniquely a nexus of collaboration between various personas, all of which have different ideas about how content should work. And we're not just talking about the content marketers or the content teams or content authors. We're not just talking about developers or architects or technical folks. We're also talking about those who are involved in compliance, those who are involved in accessibility, those who are involved in design, those who are involved, especially in marketing that is very, very tightly catered to needs of content scheduling, content embargoing, all of the things that characterize the modern marketing workflows that we see today. So Universal CMS is really a response to the fact that I think there's quite a few people now, and I've talked to a lot of folks over the last few months, I've talked to a lot of folks over the last few years, especially at the enterprise user segment of the market, as well as those who have really focused on some of the developer experience and editorial experience issues in the CMS world. And I think it's very clear that, just as hybrid headless and monolithic have sort of shown their age as terms, so to speak, I think we're seeing a little bit of that, potential instability in the way that we talk about headless and composable CMS. So with that, let me go ahead and get started here. By the way, my name is Preston. I've worked in software for about 25 years. 17 years of those I've spent specifically in the CMS world on every single side of the equation, whether that's as an agency, at an SI, at a platform company, SaaS company, and also as a designer and user myself. So I've been in the CMS world for maybe a little too long, as many of us might say. And also, by the way, this week, you'll be seeing an article come out from me at A List Apart, that venerated publication on this subject, and you'll see a lot more detail there about what I'm talking about here today. I'm also the author of 4 books. I've written 2 books on multimodal content strategy and content design, and also 2 books on code, namely Gatsby.js and also Headless Drupal. So I'm here with dotCMS. I just joined dotCMS a few months ago. dotCMS is a fantastic company. We work with some really amazing clients, both headlessly and not headlessly, across a variety of different architectures and needs, including multi-tenant. We have really great capabilities for a lot of the things that I'll be talking about today. And I'll show, just because we have limited time, I won't show a full live demo, but I will show and discuss very briefly what we're doing at dotCMS in this regard. So the first thing I want to cover is, and for those of you who are at the CMS Experts Conference in New York, some of this content will be a repeat of that, but I do want to make sure to, present this introduction for everybody who's on the call as well. But I want to talk about why we need a new equilibrium CSS. Why, not CMS, CSS, yes, cascading style sheets. CMS, why we need a new equilibrium, why we need a new balance, and why is it that there's so much frustration coming and discontent coming from a lot of customers in the CMS world. I'm going to talk about why this term Universal CMS, why it is something that has caught on, actually. So by the way, this whole idea of a Universal CMS has been something that has gained a lot of traction, not only from the hybrid headless or let's say monolithic or legacy segment of the market, but also from some headless and composable players. We've been getting a lot of mentions for this term in quite a few different places. I'll talk about that in a little bit as well. So why Universal CMS and why this term? Why do we need a new term, right? Like, there's so many terms, there's so many adjectives, hybrid headless, hybrid, headless, composable, it's just why, right? Well, let's go all the way back to the very first generation of the CMS. If you think about what I said earlier about the CMS occupying that very unique niche in the software market, the CMS is really interesting because the CMS in the very early days, in the late 90s, the early 2000s, was among the very first pieces of software that people rallied around as a true source of collaboration, rich collaboration cross-functionally between developer teams and content teams. Now, at the time, of course, that was that transition away from the sort of notion of a webmaster over to somebody who was a web developer or a front-end developer, a theme developer, if you're in WordPress or Drupal, a template developer in many of these ecosystems as well. One of the things that we've been seeing quite a bit, and I showed this slide at DrupalCon Vienna about 7 years ago now, which is an eternity ago, is that one of the biggest issues that we're seeing with the developers now moving over to modern paradigms and modern approaches using JavaScript and TypeScript and universal JavaScript is that we're seeing pressure from not only those new channels that are coming up in JavaScript, but also the channels that we now see emerging right now, including extended reality, including voice bots, chat bots, mobile apps, especially cross-platform frameworks like React Native and Flutter, as well as, of course, a lot of the things that we see that content authors and editors need, from preview and scheduling workflows, multimodally and in an omni-channel fashion. And the problem, of course, is that the static web CMS, which was that first generation of the CMS, is completely ill-equipped to handle any of the editorial needs that go beyond the humble static website. And that's absolutely fair. Because when we built the traditional CMS, right, when we built that original static web CMS, and we had that compromise, that grand compromise that characterized that first era, we didn't really think that there was going to be much else beyond the website, right? Even responsive web design wasn't really much of a difference from the way that we were building. And responsive really should have portended for us and heralded for us a huge shift in how we think about CMS writ large. That didn't happen, of course, until the headless CMS emerged. Now, the historic web-only CMS, the static web CMS, was really interesting in that it forged a grand compromise, as I wrote in CMS Wire about 4 years ago, between editorial flexibility and developer flexibility. What that means is editors and developers, these two very core personas within the CMS. And of course, when I use editors here as a persona label, I'm also referring to those folks who are compliance officers, those folks who are accessibility reviewers or accessibility specialists. I'm referring to those also who work in content but don't do that day in, day out. They might just be reviewing something for legal compliance. They might just be jumping into the CMS, jumping back out. They might be needing to preview something, but they don't really touch the CMS otherwise. So the historic web-only CMS was very interesting because the static web CMS era characterized a grand compromise, a grand equilibrium between the editors who said, as long as you give us some semblance, some control over the visual presentation of my content, right? That means drag and drop or preview. That means time machine preview, things of that nature. It means content scheduling. It means basic layout capabilities. Then you can go and innovate however you want to, build up new features, add new plugins, new modules, new what have you, depending on which CMS ecosystem you're from. And by doing so, you're able to unblock each other and not really get in each other's way. Now, what happened is with the bifurcation and the dichotomy that characterized the mid-2010s to late 2010s, which is, of course, the growth of the headless CMS, which I'll talk about more in just a little bit about why the headless CMS is such an interesting phenomenon written within the context of developer experience. What you saw is that this equilibrium no longer holds, right? Now we see that editors and content authors and those who touch the CMS and are focused on content, they can't really touch the CMS or touch the presentation layer as much as they used to before. So what's happening here is that we see, of course, in the headless CMS that developers love it, right? And everyone I speak to absolutely loves the headless CMS who's a developer, right? Anyone who's working with APIs, who's working with React or Vue.js, they absolutely love the headless CMS, the composable CMS. Editors, not so much. And one of the things I find very interesting about some of the conversations I've had over the past few months, especially with enterprise users of both the composable and monolithic segments, is that a lot of editors are very unhappy with what they perceive as the fragmentation of UIs that they have always held dear. And here's the thing. I think one of the struggles that we face is that a lot of architectural purists in the industry argue that headless is the correct move, is the correct way to do things. And I would say from an architectural perspective, that is an absolutely correct notion, an absolutely correct prerogative. But what does that mean when we can't actually go back and rewrite history, right? We've given our users in the CMS market, in the CMS industry, an expectation that they will have the same capabilities that they've always had. And if you look at some of the content editors and content authors who are the most unhappy with headless and composable CMSs and have the most buyer's remorse, you can't really tell them, well, you can't have these toys anymore, right? You can't have layout tools anymore. You can't have preview anymore in this new paradigm. Because what you're telling them is that you're actually betraying them. You're actually betraying what exactly they were able to do before. And they're losing value in the CMS rather than gaining value in the CMS. What we need is a new grand compromise, a new equilibrium, right? The static web CMS clearly was really, really good when it came to honoring this balance between both of these different personas writ large, right? But the issue is that this new world that we live in is totally different, right? We now have AI. We now have a new framework coming out once again, still, many years later, even after so many of us said, okay, React came out, now it's done, right? Just like those who said, well, Angular came out, now it's done, right? Well, now we've got Astro, now we've got Svelte, now we've got all these other frameworks coming out constantly. At the same time, marketing teams and content teams are having to struggle with and juggle many, many different channels, right? And the thing that I think is very interesting is that we're not just talking about JavaScript in isolation, or just extended reality in isolation, or just chatbots and AI in isolation. We're talking about all of these things together, all at the same time. So the Universal CMS is really born out of what Dean Barker, our dear friend who's here today, calls the race to the middle. Dean, very astutely a few months ago, around the same time that I was working on this Universal CMS concept, noted on many places, including our dear friend Larry Swanson's podcasts on content strategy, that the headless and hybrid headless segments of the CMS market are engaging in a race to the middle, where hybrid headless or formerly monolithic CMSs are racing to build APIs and SDKs and this sort of moonshot. We're also seeing another moonshot happening from the headless and composable segment where they're really trying to build visual editing and visual building capabilities. I found it very interesting, for example, that just about a month ago, React Bricks changed their entire positioning, their entire messaging away from React Headless CMS over to React Headless CMS with visual editing. So you see this happening all over the studios that are happening, all across the headless CMS world as well. We're all headed to the same place, y'all. That's where we're all headed, right? We're all headed to that center. We're engaging in convergent evolution towards a new equilibrium for the CMS, which is headless first, treats every single channel as equal citizens, treats both content teams and developer teams as equal citizens, and also is ready for and prepared for the multimodal, omnichannel, and tech-agnostic future that is going to hold very soon. So this is why Universal CMS is such an important concept, because taking aside, right, and this is why this graph looks exactly the same as the first one I showed, is editors don't care about how tough it is to edit something visually in React, right? They don't care that they might have an Angular, Vue.js, React app sitting over here, Ember.js over there, and they have, let's say, WebXR interface for Vision Pro, and also a mobile app that the developers have built out in React Native and also Flutter. Because to editors and to content authors, every channel is basically the same, is meant to be a first-class citizen. And so seeing those leaky abstractions where a lot of these things that are really particular to developers and they have to be architected a certain way, that all doesn't really matter to the editor who's sitting over here and says, I have to deliver this content out because I've got a Black Friday sale or I've got another tentpole event coming down the chute that I need to be ready for. So the Universal CMS really comes out of, I think, in some ways, a little bit of, I would say, over-opinionatedness or over-indexing potentially on the separation of concerns from an architectural perspective. The reason why Universal CMS is a term that works really well is that actually, if you rewind history as well and go back to the developer experience, now that we're setting aside the editorial experience, and think about the developer experience back in the day, you can see that some of the evolution of the CMS in the technical side has actually violated many of the separations of concerns that we see. For example, the monolithic CMS or the static web-only CMS generation was really focused on an architectural separation of concerns between the server and client. And by the way, for those who haven't seen the term separation of concerns before, in software architecture, it's basically a notion of saying, hey, let's make sure that these major things that are concerns here, that are things that we want to divide up, right? They stay separate. They are housed in different software systems, or they're housed in different layers of the software stack. But ultimately, we want to make sure to have a clean separation so that things don't get messy in between the two. What is really interesting is that we've violated so many different separations of concerns over the course of the history of the web, right? One of those, of course, is the server-client separation of concerns. Of course, back in the day when you had FTP servers and you had FileZilla, you had WebFTP approaches, all you had to do was create your static files, push them. This was the old front page, the old Dreamweaver era, and then it just comes out in the browser, right? But Universal JavaScript really turned this separation of concerns on its head, right? And the reason why Universal JavaScript was so interesting is that developers said, enough, right? We are so tired of having to use jQuery and using the dotCSS method to change styles inline within the context of the page client side. Like, we just want to have control over the entirety of the component's lifecycle, whether it's on the server side or client side. So with the advent of Node.js, now, of course, developers who are on the front end side, the JavaScript developers said, huzzah, now we can have both a server-side driven JavaScript component and a client-side driven JavaScript component, and they share the same code. They have the exact same code. They have the exact same approaches to how we want to do things. They can be rendered wherever, whether it's on the server side or client side, but it doesn't matter. So Universal JavaScript really was interesting because the very first architectural separation of concerns that was canonized within the CMS world, that was considered sacrosanct, right, by so many of those early static web CMSs, was being completely thrown out the window. Server versus client, that doesn't matter, because what matters more is a good developer experience with shared components and shared code across client and server. Now, the headless CMS took this approach and ran with it, right? They said, okay, great, yes, let's do everything in JavaScript on the server and client, right? But the CMS really becomes more of just a glorified data layer. Well, of course, the problem with that is that it doesn't really work well for the personas, because back in the day when the static web CMS combined content as data and content as presentation, that being, of course, the responsibility of content teams and the responsibility of developer teams in a single software package. Now, of course, what they're saying is, no, content teams, no, editors, authors, all you get to do is work with these API resources, input data, glorified data entry. That's all that really is, that's all that you need to do, right? And that was the case of that first initial generation of headless CMSs, which developers loved, but editors were left scratching their heads a little bit about. But if you think about the fact that, well, content is not just about data, right? Content is not just about presentation. Content, at the end of the day, is about people, right? Content is really about who we are and how we interact with content and how we serve content to other people. Content is also about collaboration between people. And if you think about content and CMSs within the context of personas, what we see is that there's some really big shifts in how the headless CMS thinks about content as data and content as presentation. Namely, of course, that the headless CMS no longer really grants editors and marketers full control over things like visual preview, visual building, and all of the other things that are so important to those authoring teams, without, of course, the aid of a large technical team. And I want to say here that headless and composable CMSs do work very well, and they are really great solutions. But in my experience, and also from what I've seen, you really need to have a large body or a large bench of developer talent or engineering talent to really be successful with this. I remember I had a conversation just a few months ago with an enterprise user of CMS who had made the shift away from hybrid headless over to a composable architecture. And they were under the impression that the visual building capabilities and visual preview capabilities would just come out of the box. And they were shocked to learn, of course, that here comes along the vendor and says, well, here's a statement of work. Here's a contract that you can sign with our partner or our professional services team, and it's going to be 6 months before you can have visual building. As you can imagine, the customer wasn't very happy, and they got off the headless CMS and went running right back to a hybrid headless architecture. The problem with enforcing an architectural separation of concerns like this between content as data and content as presentation is that we're really forgetting that content is about both. Content is about both data and presentation, and both editors and developers need to be able to touch and work with both of those notions of content at the same time in the same place. They're really shared concerns. And if you think about it, Universal CMS is not really that much different from Universal JavaScript, right? Just as Universal JavaScript said, hey, developers, guess what? To make your experience a lot better, we're going to violate and completely turn around this separation of concerns because we want to have code that's shared across all of the server and client, to straddle the server and client divide, and to have components that you can manage yourself, right? The Universal CMS is really about saying the same thing. Hey, editors, hey, developers, yeah, let's do components, right? But let's also focus on the fact that this content as data and content as presentation separation of concerns no longer really works, no longer is something that is appropriate. And you see this now in how we see terminology drift, right? Headless CMS no longer truly means pure headless, right? Headless CMS really means kind of headless, sort of headless, especially as they begin continuing their forays into visual editing and visual building. By the same token, hybrid headless or monolithic, I mean, that's, it's not really the right term anymore, right? Because of the fact that, well, hybrid headless is really starting to become more headless first, is really starting to become more focused on some of these developer ecosystem needs because they recognize that JavaScript is here to stay. Composable also, I think, is one of those that is a term that, obviously many people have taken and run with, and now it sort of means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Orchestration is another one of those words. But I do think that when it comes to composable, what really is interesting about composable is composable for whom, right? Composable for the editors, composable for the content authors, for the marketers, or is it really just composable for the developers, and you got to have a developer sitting next to you as you compose your solution set together? So the Universal CMS is really about several crucial things, right? Which is we want to make sure as a CMS industry that we're enabling any sort of front end, any sort of presentation layer that you can imagine. And at dotCMS, this is our vision for how the Universal CMS will be. But this is obviously solely our opinion. I do believe Universal CMS as a concept is something that's going to be spreading quite quickly across the entire market. We've already seen a lot of folks hop on the train with us. But one of the key components here is the ability to be tech agnostic and omnichannel, right? Entirely agnostic to what it is that the content is going to end up in. Also editing anything using a shared single visual editorial interface, which is something that the headless and composable CMSs have really struggled with. And finally, using any infrastructure, right? Anywhere across the stack. The CMS, really should be able to go anywhere, and it also should be touching a lot of different aspects of infrastructure. That being said, of course, you're going to have an SDK, for example, that you put into your React application. That's something that you're going to host from the CMS on a JavaScript hosting provider, for instance, right? The CMS no longer becomes a single hosted software tool. It becomes something that's spread across the stack. So this is kind of the vision for Universal CMS from my standpoint, and you'll soon see more about this, obviously, from my article in A List Apart going out this week, as well as some of my articles that are coming up on Preston So. But the Universal CMS is really about restoring that equilibrium that the static web CMS gave us, right? Content teams, developer teams as first-class citizens, tech agnostic, universally developable, universally buildable, omni-channel, universally editable, cross-channel, stack agnostic, universally deployable, right? And then of course, AI-enabled, universally generable. I'm running a 5-part article series about this. And if you want to follow my blog, Preston.so, subscribe to my newsletter, I'll share more about this as well. Just because we're running out of time here, let me just skip to the Universal CMS Summit. I know, Yannis, I know. So the Universal CMS Summit is an event that we're hosting. It's entirely vendor agnostic. It's an event that is meant to bring together all of us here in the CMS world to talk about how we can better enable CMSs for the future. Not in the headless composable way, not in the hybrid headless or monolithic way, but in a way that is a tide that lifts all boats. So please join us on August 5th in Montreal, Canada. It'll be right before the CMS Connect conference that's also being held in Montreal that Tuesday and Wednesday. And we've already got confirmed attendances from people on both sides, right? Not just the monolithic or hybrid headless, but also from the headless composable. We're most likely going to have as far as confirmed speakers go, we've got folks from Crown Peak joining us, folks from Magnolia who are going to be there, Typo 3 as well. There's also going to be, we're confirming this week, some speakers from the headless and composable side as well. So please join us. This is not a dotCMS event. This is a vendor agnostic, completely vendor neutral event. We're just really interested in having a conversation about how we can push forward the CMS industry together. Thank you.
That's great, Preston. Hey, we made it. And for this one, we still have a couple of minutes left for Q&A. I did see a little bit on the chat, but I think that was mostly just praise for the use of words. I'm going to have fun typing this up, Preston. Any comments, feedbacks, slides, reflections? Anybody wants to chime in? We have time. So I think I saw Dominic here on the call. You're joining in Montreal as well?
Yes, I do.
Any big takeaways from this? I think you've heard about some of this before. Any new insights here?
No new insights. I was just thinking how this may work like in reality, and I can see like multiple technology challenges. So I'm happy to learn more about that on that summit, and looking forward to have the discussion. I like the concept. I think that this is what's needed for the future, because I think that many clients actually now realize the costs and the disadvantages connected with the headless, but nobody wants to go back to the pure monolithical, right? So the question is like, what's the future? So in theory, I really like the concept, but interested to see how this could be really implemented, because just from where I sit, I see a few technological challenges which definitely needs to be solved.
Very good. Preston, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I mentioned, so Dominic, thanks so much. Yeah, I didn't have a chance to show the demo of what we're working on at dotCMS, obviously in this regard. We can definitely hop on a call at some point and I can show you that. But those who were at the CMS Experts meetup remember that I showed that quick demo. The way that we're really solving this is, and I think there's two approaches to this, right? There's sort of the, let's say, the the ambitious or the probably near impossible side of things, which is there's a lot of discussion around creating standards and creating some sort of a unified approach to, how we deliver SDKs, how we deliver APIs, having a shared interoperability standard within CMSs. I know the Mock Alliance is talking about that as well, which they, in my opinion, should have been talking about many years ago. But I think one of the challenges, of course, is that at the end of the day, we are in a competitive market or in a competitive industry. So I think the Universal CMS Summit is a great place for us to talk about those higher level meta standards. What we're focusing on at dotCMS is really around how we enable tech agnostic work and channel agnostic work. And the way that we're doing that is by focusing on two things. We're focusing on tech agnostic, so framework agnosticism, which means React, Vue.js, Angular, what have you, and also the cross-channel aspect, which is really focused on those web renderable layers, right? Because JavaScript, at the end of the day, is now the de facto language of experiences beyond the web, WebAssembly notwithstanding, right? So if you think about, for example, a Vision Pro app, right, that can be done in WebXR. If you think about, for example, a mobile app that's native, that's an APK, that can be done in React Native or Flutter, right? If you think about some of the ways in which we're moving towards AI, for instance, chatbots, you now see a lot of folks experimenting with voice bot preview within the context of a web rendered layer. So that aspect, I think, is very interesting as well, and will give us a lot of interesting sorts of fodder to discuss around standards. And yes, Rebecca, I agree about the semantic space. I think semantic web, obviously schema.org, all of that. I think that's a lot of the way there. I think what we need is not just from the content side, but also from the developer side, that sort of standardization. And I'm not familiar with what folks are doing over at the Mock Alliance around interoperability standards. Haven't seen much about it. Very curious to learn about what they're doing, but yeah, we'll see how things go.
That's all we had, Preston. Thank you so much for your time. I'll do my best to type it up. If okay with you, Preston, I'll share the slides as well alongside the recording, and I'll link to all of the great blog posts and also the podcast by Larry featuring Dean Barker. Thank you once again, Preston. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Tusen takk, and take care.
Hey, all the best. Talk soon.